Yeah. So, last week we spent a little bit of time talking about kind of setting up the issue, this culture of busyness. And then this week, we ran out of time. we got so busy into that topic that we ran out of time. And so this week we're going to spend a little more time talking about the antidote, or a potential antidote to this culture of busyness. So let's begin with prayer from the Book of Common Prayer for the good use of leisure. The Lord be with you. O God, in the course of this busy life, give us times of refreshment and peace, and grant that we may so use our leisure to rebuild our bodies and renew our minds, that our spirits may be opened to the goodness of your creation. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And for those of you who would like to pull that out as a regular, you can find it on the page 8 to 25 of the Book of Common Prayer. And so just to recap a little bit from last week for those who were not here, Joan, this is kind of her thesis for this little, it's a 2.5-page meditation, okay? But we measure ourselves by our productivity and every day become more exhausted, less rested in mind, body, and spirit, and so less capable of producing things, let alone develop relationships as a result. And so we spent some time last week talking about this idea of this beginning here, do we measure ourselves by our productivity? And we had a nice discussion about that, and I think you can always revisit it in your own mind by just reminding ourselves how when we introduce ourselves to each other, we often say, "Who are you?" And our answer often is, what you do, yeah. It's phrased often, I am. I am a lawyer. I am a doctor. I am a priest. I am this, that, or the other thing. And so we really kind of grappled a little bit with this idea that in our culture, in our society, we very much are what we do for a living. We confuse those two things, at least. And we sort of grappled with that idea. And of course, that opens up all kinds of things, right? With the big taboo that we don't talk about in our culture, which is how much do we earn? How much do we make? We don't talk about that. We keep that sacrosanct, right? Why? Because I think at some level, this idea of how much we earn, if who we are is what we do to make a living, then how much we earn must be some kind of measure on our value. And so we keep that quiet. And even if we're making lots of money, we keep it quiet because we don't want to make someone else feel bad. If I make more money than you, again, it's because maybe at some intrinsic level I understand that goes to your value. And so I'm going to keep that to myself, whether I'm happy with what I earn or not. And we just talked a little bit about how this culture of busyness and productivity has evolved in our world, in our country. The average work week is it's 47 hours. In 1980 it was 38. We work an average of 47 weeks today. In 1980 it was 43. So we're working longer hours every week, and we're working more hours or more weeks in the year. And there's some stats about 20% of moms used to work in the 20s. Today, 70% of households are in the workplace full-time. In America, we are terrible at taking vacations. 56% did not take any vacation last year. Who is that true for here in this room, by the way? Anybody else besides me? Was that true for you? Am I the only one?
I'm sorry, here's the question.
Who did not take a vacation last year?
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how many folks are still in the workforce in some fashion? Just out of curiosity. So about half. So those of you who did not raise your hand or are in the workforce, good for you. The United States is the only industrialized country that doesn't mandate paid vacations. And we talked a little bit about how busyness has become a kind of a status symbol in our country, in our culture today. All you have to do is Google this, and you'll find that there are hundreds, if not millions, of articles and blogs, and everybody is really grappling with this question. And I really think this is going to be increasingly the topic that we're talking about in our country. You know, consumerism, absolutely, but this culture of busyness is, I think we're just starting to realize how much of an obstacle this is to our sense of happiness and fulfillment. I mean, they're just endless. And we talked a little bit about what drives this busyness, this idea of keeping up with the Joneses, this sense that if we don't seem busy, then maybe, again, back to that productivity. If we don't appear busy, then maybe we're not in demand, and if we're not in demand, then maybe somehow we're not valued. And we talked about the impact that digital communication has had in kind of taking all of this kind of stuff that maybe has always been there and just sort of ramped it up, taking it to a whole new level with social media, with email. I mean, I can actually remember a time when email was just starting to happen when I started entering the workforce in a significant way. And I was a lawyer, and nobody communicated with lawyers via email. Nobody would have dreamed, at least when I started doing that. I certainly wouldn't have dreamed to write them in an email, because you're creating a paper trail and all this. But now that's prevalent, right? It's all over the place. And we talked about, to what degree is our busyness? I mean, if you Google this topic, they come at it from every angle. The psychology of it, our addiction to dopamine, right? Every time we get those email messages or those text messages or a phone call or an invitation, we get a hit of dopamine. And in this technology-driven world, this digital world, I don't know about you, but I get so many more invitations than I ever used to. Ever. And there's anyway, they come at it from all these different angles. And one of the angles that we're starting to wonder about in this busyness culture is, do we have somewhere a fear of stillness? And there was this study that I mentioned last week about, this was my favorite one that epitomizes that. They paid people to basically sit in a room alone with themselves, their own thoughts, not their BlackBerries, not their cell phones. And could you just sit there for between 6 and 15 minutes? And they gave them the option of an self-administered electric shock if it got to be too much. And 60% of people, 80% of men, 25% of women opted for the shock. Yeah?
They should be shocked.
Yeah. But then we joked about that. Can you imagine, we had 2 dinner parties at our house last week. And we were joking about this in the conversation last week. What if, instead of like everybody, doing a game or getting involved in an activity after dinner, we all just kind of sat in silence for 15 minutes and just practiced a presence of being with each other? And someone said, I think I would have gone for the electric shock. I mean, it is kind of countercultural and in an extreme way. But even with ourselves, right? Obviously with a group that's kind of unusual, that would be kind of silly, but unless that was the purpose of the group. And so Joan Chittister kind of says, look, here's the thing, and she uses a couple different quotes. I didn't use this one last week, so I put it up from Leonardo da Vinci. Every now and again, go away, have a little relaxation, come back to your work, and your judgment will be sure. And to go some distance, because the work will appear smaller, and a lack of harmony and proportion is more readily seen. Okay, Leonardo da Vinci figured that out way before Facebook and email, right? And the hyper-consumer culture and Amazon.com and all that stuff. So she kind of points out that this has really been ancient wisdom. And again, I think one of the takeaways I had from our conversation last week is, yeah, this has all been out there for a long time, and it just seems to be ramped up even more today. So let's talk about a Christian response, and that is Sabbath. So where does Sabbath come from? This is from Genesis. God saw all that he made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. And by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, so that on the seventh day he rested. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So there's this sense that woven into the very heart of creation, of the Creator, actually, right? Both the Creator and creation, is this concept of rest. And so, talk about ancient wisdom. So, and then, of course, it makes its way into the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not do any work. You, your sons or daughters, your male or female slaves, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. In other words, it's not just, it's for the whole community and anyone under your care. So we're not just to observe it, but we're actually to offer it to others. So I'm kind of curious for all of you, for any of you, what, as a kid growing up maybe, what were your practices around Sabbath? Did you keep that in your house? Did you notice it in your communities? Was there a time when stores were closed? What were the what help me recall that time, or the time of your time? Yeah.
Well, we would get up, we'd go to church, Sunday school and church. We'd get home, we'd go to a roast in, we'd have Sunday dinner after church, and that was when we'd have friends come over, and there was always a nap in there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no sports involvement or anything like that, and it was a rest. It was a change from the everyday schedule of all of the clubs and activities that we did, and I love it and find myself wanting to do that, get back again.
Did your family talk about it as Sabbath, or was it just kind of just understood that?
No, it was.
Yeah.
It was based on those scriptures in the
Yeah.
church that we were involved in. So,
Mhm.
yeah, it was deliberate.
Do you want to hand her the microphone to,
Oh, do I
or,
really
or
speak
pass
in
it to the next person?
I was just going to add to that. We didn't go to church every Sunday, but we did go for a Sunday drive. And in this area, that's when people had one car.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I guess my father was working because he was driving. But we go out Grand River, and they had, I don't know if anyone remembers Jensen's Buttermilk. We go out to Wall Lake, and we were sort of resting.
Yeah. So it was like dedicated family time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sunday dinners, Sunday family dinners. I wonder if that is a evolution from that practice. Yeah, anyone else? How did you observe Sabbath as a, yeah, Dick, right there.
And our tradition was to go to church on Sundays and have a family dinner. A couple weeks ago, I met some Mormons who were on a mission. And I was reminded that the Mormon church really does take Sunday off.
Mm. Do they? Do they not? They don't worship on Sundays either? They do? Okay. Yeah. Eric.
My recollections, at least of living around here, are mixed. My father would decide that he would do a big all my homework off until Sunday. So it wasn't what you'd call an ideal Sabbath, but I have one memory of a time in my sometime in my late 40s or early 50s when I was staying in New York with my cousin on the Upper East Side. I went out for a walk after I went to church in her neighborhood. And I saw things in Central Park that had a tremendous impact on me. Way over near West End Boulevard, West End Avenue, was an inline skating rink. And an Asian girl with ivory skin and a black waterfall of hair was trying her first inline skating. Her boyfriend, who was a stunningly handsome African-American boy, was gently skating backward in front of her to guide her and holding her hands. And as I walked on in the park, I saw another interracial couple, this time in their 50s or 60s. He was white, she was black, and they were asleep in each other's arms, wrapped up in the New York Times to prevent sunburn. And everywhere I saw people either playing or being with each other, or both. Be what God has in mind. Playing, being with each other.
Yeah, white space, sometimes it's called. Margin space. Have you seen our bulletin lately? There's not a lot of white space in that bulletin, you know, so there's this question of how do we create white space for just free play, Yeah, anyone else? How about, yeah.
We went to church and Sunday school in church, and then we would come to our house and we would have dinner like what I've heard here. Included in that was my grandfather and grandmother and my aunt. My grandfather was the minister in the church, and that was all very Sabbath Eve, whatever the word is. Mm-hmm. However, at the dinner every Sunday, my father and my aunt, she was a school teacher and he was a lawyer and eventually a judge, spent 2 hours arguing. He knew more about education than she did, even though he'd never taught. She knew more about the law than he did, even though she'd never been near a law school. So we had a sort of a combination. And again, the issue of rest, the part I remember was the arguments, which was certainly not rest.
and perhaps a rest from their work conversations, maybe. But yeah, anybody experience Sabbath as a kind of as a negative, meaning don't do this, don't do that? Anybody have experiences like that? Was it presented as a negative imperative in some way? No? So let's kind of chew on this business of Sabbath, and I'm going to draw upon, this is one of those topics, by the way. There has been an amazing amount of thought and literature and reflection on this, and there's probably two big ones that I would recommend that I'm going to kind of draw upon here a little bit. And then the first is The Sabbath by Abraham Heschel, and the second one is Sabbath as Resistance by Walter Brueggemann. They're both rather small reads, interestingly. But they're really give you a lot to think about on this topic of Sabbath. They come at it from a lot of ways. One of the things I really like from Walter Brueggemann's perspective is this idea of divine rest. So the idea that God, the Creator, would rest. Some people object to that concept, by the way, the idea that God needed to rest. You know, they may be taking it kind of from a literal perspective. What's that say about God, that God could get exhausted, you know? But what is it? What is the positive side of that? This idea of divine rest. And so Walter Brueggemann, in his kind of plain-spoken kind of way, says three things. Number one, God is not a workaholic. Number two, he is not anxious, or I shouldn't say God is not anxious about the full functioning of creation. God can take a day off, and did. And most importantly, the well-being of creation is not dependent on ceaseless work. Remember, God created all these things and they were good. And then God could rest. And they stayed good. They didn't fall apart. They didn't need the constant management and continual creation. Yeah.
I have a problem with the whole Sabbath concept.
Sure. Yeah, you bet.
Because as a Christian, I don't think God just sat back and said, go on your own.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he took the trouble to send his son to do something for us. So God didn't stop after 6 days. You know, Jesus came during the seventh day and he's still working with us.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So how do you reconcile the fact that Jesus is working while God is resting?
Well, let's take a look at the Jesus' response to the Sabbath, right? Because it's an important one to look at, because Jesus kind of expands the understanding of Sabbath a little bit. That's one way of looking at it. I'd say another way too is those are kind of, that hymn of creation is kind of on a different level than the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit and Jesus. Because the idea of Sabbath, at the end of the day, is the work that Jesus was called to do as well. It's the work of bringing us into closer relationship with God. And so, in a sense, Jesus is calling us to a Sabbath life all the time. And so, it's not about kicking back and relaxing. It's about the ongoing work of reconciliation of the world and creation. So I would reconcile those things at least on one level in that way. Anybody else have some thoughts on that? It's kind of interesting.
Well, I have a question though. So when you say Sabbath, how are you defining Sabbath? As a resistance, that to me makes it seem like, okay, as a resistance, then I am going to be maybe like the Mormon Church, and I am not going to have any planned activities, and we are not going to do things. So, which would be a resistance if you go up against all that is scheduled that people's children have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So are we talking about a specific day, or are we talking about a mental, emotional awareness that you just, like you said, practice the Sabbath all the time?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a both. I think it's potentially a both and. And it's something that I don't. As with so many things within our kind of Christian faith and our discipleship, it eludes being put into a box. And so, to some degree, Sabbath is about a day of rest, yeah, and it's about a mindset for every day in which we live. So it's both as resistance to the production, to the productivity economy, to our essence as being defined by our productivity. It's a resistance to that. But it's also an alternative way of living. It's an alternative economy. So it's a resistance to the world's economy in some ways, to the production economy, to Pharaoh's economy of ceaseless work. And it's an invitation into God's economy, which includes rest. And rest not just necessarily for rest's sake. So yeah, those are good. Yeah, exactly. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? How do you understand the Sabbath? Throw things out as we go, because we're going to keep chewing on this. I'm not giving you the one answer here. You want?
This is, in a way, a response to Barry's interesting reading on the Genesis story. I'd never thought, if I understood you properly, I'd never thought that the Bible meant that God sat back on the evening of the sixth day and said, that's it forever and ever. Is that how you understand it? Well, Jesus himself says in the Gospel of John, when he's lambasted by the Pharisees for healing somebody on the Sabbath, Jesus rather cryptically remarks, my Father is still working, and so am I. So I don't think the Genesis story, under correction, I don't think the Genesis story is saying that God immediately becomes a hands-off God. And second, I just want to say one lovely, very common English word. And I just thought of it in a whole new sense. And the word we use for leisure is recreation, recreation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So let's keep throwing these things out, and I'll keep throwing some Brueggemann at you, and it will all become murky and murkier, and there'll be some wisdom that erupts, I think. But yeah, I think that's well said, Eric. So Walter Brueggemann would argue that that the Sabbath is an introduction of a new rhythm of life. So as I was just summarizing a second ago, it's no longer going to be defined as slavery and ceaseless production under the, remember this was Exodus, right? So they're in captivity, they're slaves in Egypt, and the world of Pharaoh is ceaseless production. Endless demand schedules for more materials to build ever bigger buildings and pyramids, whatever he was doing. That was the slave life. And I know in 21st century America, we have no concept of that anymore, right? I mean, that's why we spent that time on this culture of busyness, because this economy of Pharaoh is not just an ancient concept that has no relevance any longer. And in the same way, Sabbath is just as relevant, if not more so today than ever.
The culture of business.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people in the world who are busy, not because of their culture, they have to do that to survive.
Mm-hmm.
They have to have 2 or 3 jobs. They have to work 7 days a week, or they can't. And to me, if you're going to have a day of rest, you ought to do something with all the people who have needs in the world. We ought to be doing it 7 days a week, but let's take that 7th day and let's do something to help somebody else.
Well said. And that's essentially the Jesus position, right? When the Pharisees argue that, wait, you got to keep the Sabbath, that means don't do work. And to the response that Eric just sort of summarized a minute ago, he says, wait a minute, you know. So Sabbath isn't just a ceasing from work. It's the ongoing work, in some ways, the ongoing work of reconciling creation. And so, yeah, one wonderful way of observing the Sabbath would be to work for those for whom a Sabbath is impossible. Whether that's to help them, serve them, or change the system, right? So I mentioned in America we have no mandated, we're the only industrialized country with no mandated vacation. You know? That might be important for folks who have to work 3 jobs. So yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, extrapolating from Jesus, which we'll look at in a second, I think that's a very reasonable response. Anybody have any thoughts on that or response to that? We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but yeah. So this new rhythm of life, thus, is not intended as a series of shall nots merely. That's the place you start. It's not the place you end. That it's an invitation into holy time, into sanctified time, and as Eric was mentioning, recreation as recreation. Recreating yourself, restoring, renewing, healing, mending. And so, to this point that we were just talking about, right? So we have a couple moments in all of the Gospels. I've just pulled a couple from Mark, where if you remember the disciples are kind of taking grain on their way along the roadside or something, and it's the Sabbath, and the Pharisees call them out on that. And Jesus responds that the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. And then a little bit while later, he is healing somebody with his hand, and he gets called out again. And to your point just now, is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath, to save or to kill? And he looked around them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he was restored on the Sabbath. So Sabbath as recreation, as mending, as healing. So it's not. So I receive that as Sabbath not simply as a legalistic, thou shalt not work, but thou shalt work toward the kingdom, perhaps. Does that make sense? Any thoughts on that? So this thing that kicked this off, Joan Chittister's comment was, she's pointing out the contradiction between the need for how rest can actually help our productivity. But the Sabbath wasn't about so that we could be more productive slaves for Pharaoh. The Sabbath was for us to exit the economy of Pharaoh altogether, or to at least put a marker in the sand to say, this is not the way creation was made. Creation wasn't supposed to be about endless work.
When you talk about productive and Sabbath, there were a lot, at least when I was going to university in the 60s, they talked a lot about work study and all those type of things. And those people found that if people took Sunday off, they were more productive on the days they did work. So at least it wasn't a religious Sabbath.
That's right.
It was a case of an efficiency Sabbath. Take a day off and work harder when you are working.
Yeah, and the studies are everywhere out there that is exactly the case. And we talked a little bit about that last week, that our productivity actually declines after X amount of work hours per week. They've done studies on that. Yeah, absolutely. And how rest and relaxation can make us more productive. Okay, that's interesting. But I wonder if God had something bigger in mind with the Sabbath. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this, because I felt like the book kind of ended there, and that's an interesting truth. Yeah, absolutely, right? That's a contradiction, that our productivity can actually increase with rest. Amen. But, what is the Sabbath really about beyond that? Or is that even about that at all? Does it have anything to do with increasing our productivity? A little bit more from Brueggemann. What about the idea that Sabbath is not just about work denying or work avoiding, but it might be about work assessing, work reflecting, work appreciating? How might we work differently because of the time taken on the Sabbath to wonder? Can we be more spiritual at work? Can we be a witness? Can we be a disciple in our workplace, for example? Can we work differently? I did a class last year, kind of a book study, small group thing, where we invited people to imagine themselves. They're all folks who worked full time. Imagine themselves as if they were a kind of chaplain in their workplace. Unordained, uncommissioned, yet baptismally commissioned at least, such that they didn't just go to work looking to be productive and to do a good job and all those wonderful things, but to actually bring a sense of intentional caring for their coworkers, to be a different kind of listener, to be a different type of coworker, to imagine themselves as a kind of chaplain. Mel, were you going to say something?
That I think as you go through this, what Brueggemann suggests and others is that your perspective can change and it becomes more holistic. So for me, I used to have life's priorities, and one of them was recreation, and it was always not getting the care that I should have spent time in the Sabbath thought process. But today, I don't have that on my priority list. It's replaced by fulfillment. And the reason I use fulfillment is kind of what's in the second paragraph there. It's about being productive in a different way. Caring for my community, caring for my common man. It's not just about me. Where the recreation was about me separating myself to get a break. Today, I know that if I'm fulfilled, I'm getting the nourishment that I think is meant by recreation. I love that. Nice. And that it also indicates you have a balance in your life. Because without a balance, you'll have anxiety. With anxiety, you'll have a lot of other negative characteristics that are permeating other things that you do in life. So Sabbath restores, and my term of fulfillment is my barometer to know that I'm in balance.
Right, so yeah, exactly. That second paragraph, that Sabbath is about standing back from the ethos of productivity to reclaim your humanity. That's why you can't think of Sabbath simply as a break from work, because then you're still basically defined by your productivity. And it can't just be an opportunity to increase your productivity, because again, your humanity is still being defined by your productivity. And if we are made in the image of God, and God rested, then perhaps our humanity is tied to this business of rest as well.
Appreciate. If you think of what God did on the seventh day, he took time to appreciate. This is good. There was light, and it was good. And then when he had the whole, he appreciated it. That's what Sabbath means to me.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
Okay, so reading that last paragraph, the question comes to my mind, if we have all these variety of opinions on what a Sabbath is, how do we practice Sabbath, and what that then does to you, depending on how you interpret it. But could it be that the reason that God brought up the whole subject of Sabbath is to help us to not identify with just work? Is it just the identifying? Or not thinking of you being validated by our busyness or whatever our field is? Maybe that is the whole point of Sabbath, and that mindset is to get us off of ourself.
Yeah. Yeah, has anyone heard the saying about the Sabbath? Imitate God in order to remind yourself that you're not God. Imitate God by taking a Sabbath in order to remind yourself that you're not God. In other words, to take your hands off the controls, right? To realize that no matter how much work we do, no matter how efficient we can get, no matter how good our technology becomes, right? It's never going to be enough. It's never going to be enough in that Pharaoh production economy world. It's never enough. Enough is never enough. More is always better, right? And so we're trying to separate. So the idea of Sabbath is to separate ourselves from that understanding of what it means to be.
To be. I think that is the key.
Yeah.
That is something I noticed in Europe, too. There's, you meet a lot of people, and there is that sense more so of just being them. Not like, who they are, what they do, or whatever. And I'm just wondering how much it's related to their time off. I mean, because when they're working, they're on, and when they're off, they're off, and they are off a lot.
Yeah, the United States, we are second to none in production, absolutely. But if you look at happiness surveys, we fare worse than Mexico, and a lot of other countries. So as was said, I love this. Creation is already good. Your ceaseless labor is not required. It's not all about you. And so the Sabbath is about trusting in God as well. It invites us to trust in God, to step back from this constant competition, this constant sense of doing, and to be. So we have about 5-6 minutes here. So I want to talk a little bit about what are the challenges to observing the Sabbath. I'll just throw out some of the ones I came up with. Maybe you guys can offer some more. But how many here would actually observe Sabbath in a significant, regular, focused way? In however you define that term. Okay. I don't mean to say 8 o'clock on Friday through let go of the legalism. But who here would say that they're a regular practitioner of Sabbath? Anyone? Quasi, a little bit? Dick, good for you. So what are some of the problems with that? Nobody else is doing it. Our friends, our coworkers, I never, as a lawyer, clients expected me to be on call all the time, checking the email. Maybe our own family and friends don't really get it either. There's this endless need to catch up on work. That's one of the biggest challenges for me on Sabbath. It's a chance to catch up on work because there's no meetings. But you're still working. I'm still producing. Yeah. You don't want to miss out on things. Some of that stuff that we acknowledged under the culture of busyness. How about this one? This was brought up last week a little bit, and maybe it was. But how about this idea of, I don't know if I really need a Sabbath. I like my work. My work is rest, resting in God. You know, we do have this culture where, particularly millennials now, are really focused on finding their passion in work, that they find their purpose through their work. And so there is this idea that work and purpose and fulfillment could be so intertwined such that there is no need for Sabbath because I'm perpetually in that zone. And I think that's something that we will discover is largely not true. Any other challenges you guys face as you try to observe Sabbath in the ways that you do? You know, I would avoid getting caught up in legalism. You know, is it Saturday or Sunday? What time is it supposed to start? Does X, Y, or Z count as work? You know, don't get yourself caught up in that. There's this important point. This was brought up last week, and it was brought up just a minute ago. You know, what about fairness? I know clergy that would do an autoresponder on weekends saying, I'm on my Sabbath. Saturday is my Sabbath. I won't be able to respond to your email until Monday or something. And they would get blowback from parishioners. I don't have a Sabbath. I don't get one. Yeah. And you know, that hurts my heart to hear that. And so to your point about maybe one way to observe the Sabbath is to work for a world where everyone can take one, where everyone is freed from Pharaoh's captivity. Here's a couple ideas. We're coming up on Lent, so I'm going to throw some ideas out there. If you're intrigued by this idea of Sabbath and you want to recommit or re-energize your idea of Sabbath, here's a couple ideas that I came up with throughout any that you come up with. But try to practice it in community. Do it with other people. Get your small group, your family, get your spouse on board. Start realistically. Don't pick a whole day. If this is new to you, try to do a half day. Start somewhere. Obviously, turn off the technology. That stuff pulls me right out. I get those. Turn off the notifications. You know, the blings, the beeps. Consider doing a little ritual to begin to mark the beginning and the end somehow. Light a candle, say a prayer. Have a meal, the Sunday meal or the Saturday meal, as a way of kicking it off or celebrating its end. Give thought to what you might do. So, you know, what is it that recreates you? Is it walking in the park? Is it enjoying creation? Is it reading? Is it, animated conversations about politics? Because you never have a chance to talk about that, anywhere else. Maybe for you it is. Maybe that's part of it. Serving the poor, going to church more regularly. Notice, do you talk about your busyness with others? When you answer, how are you? Or ask yourself when you get asked, who are you? Maybe you think about a different answer. Who are you made by God to be? What are you up to as your answer? Try on a season of Sabbaths. Lent is fantastic for that. Here's a potential one you might want to try. You could try this on for Lent. Here it is. It's the Busy Boycott Challenge. You could do this with other people online. It's a little. It's for I think 3 or 4 weeks, but you could stretch that out over Lent. Try it for 3 weeks. How many of us keep our Lenten practices up for 3 weeks anyway? Just Google Busy Boycott Challenge. I'm going to do it, just for fun. I threw in here Simplify your non-Sabbath life. So a big challenge to practicing Sabbath is our overcommitted life. How could you simplify that? How can you start to say no to things? Or to just edit the things you say yes to, more intentionally. Do fewer things well. I remember talking to somebody at a Christmas party. It was a big Christmas party, and he was saying, oh yeah, this is my 5th Christmas party of today. And I'm like, what? He's like, oh yeah, we're just going around from one to another, just, making an appearance. And I'm like, oh, how fulfilling that must feel. I mean, it was like he was kind of life bragging in a way, right? I'm so important, I got invited to 5 Christmas parties. How many did you get invited to? But why go to that many if you're just going to pop in? Hello, how's everybody? Are you really? Are you like the president or something? I mean, where are you going to have a meaningful conversation? Is that even a concern to you, or was you only being driven by saying yes, pleasing people, showing up, feeling a part of the crowd? What was really, and is that any of that really fulfilling at the end of the day? We talked about working to extend it to others. Try that practice that study, those folks at the study couldn't do. If you don't do this at home, try this. Try 15 minutes of just sitting in silence. Through 40 days of that. Yeah. Don't organize your to-do list. Don't think about your calendar. Don't think about, all those calls you got to make. Try to just practice stillness. Did we have a contemplative prayer group here at Christ Church? No? Yeah. Maybe we'll see that. We're all pretty busy though, I don't know. May not have time for that. But anyway, yeah, try that out. Try that out. Just practice it. You see if you get better at it. It'll be really hard at first. Trust me. Even retired folks. I know you guys are as busy as, if not busier than anybody. Yes. Any other ideas that people have for practicing Sabbath? How do you guys do it? Anything that you want to share with the group before we end? All right. If you want to take a look at any of these books, I will leave them up here. And here's all those websites, but I'll just leave these. So here's the takeaway. Here's the invitation. So this coming Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, where we are reminded that we are dust, and the dust we shall return. And then we begin Lent. Imagine for yourself, what would Sabbath look like for you? What's the next right thing for you as you try to practice rest in a way that doesn't just make you more productive and more rested and ready to take on the world, but in a way that would allow you to be in the world differently, so that you might move the world just a little bit to the kingdom that we're called to create. So I hope you can find some rest this Lent. Thank you.